Good morning, everybody. Welcome this morning to COVID-19, What We Know and Common Questions for Employers, the September installment in our annual update series.
So by way of a few housekeeping matters, if you have questions, please submit them via the chat function on your screen, and we'll try to answer them at the end, but by all means, do type them and send them as we go, and if we can address them during the session, we will. We are recording this, and a PDF of the slides will be available later this morning as well. Also available later this morning will be your certificates for SHRM for any continuing education credits. And I'm going to turn it back over to Liz for the agenda.
Thanks, Rob. So by way of a quick introduction, my name is Liz Johnston, and I'm an associate attorney in Farrell's Labor and Employment Law Group. So I hope everybody's doing well today. I think if it was a year ago, I'm not sure any of us thought we would be here for yet another update session on more COVID-19 related topics, and today especially COVID related unknowns, but we can't be so lucky. So we're really glad that you could be here today to join us, and we are planning to talk about a number of issues that I'm sure many of you have seen in the news, a lot of issues that our clients have been asking about, what we're seeing trending on state and national levels, as well as talk about those issues and those details about those updates that we just don't have the answers to quite yet. We also want to talk about some issues that you might be familiar with, that you might have seen it come up in your workplace, your organization, and hopefully shed some clarity amid the changes and updates that have occurred over the past several months. So some of the specific topics we're going to focus on today relate to vaccination mandates for COVID-19, specifically federal level and state level mandates, including the recently announced federal mandate for vaccinations. We're also going to talk about updates and considerations to leave for COVID-19 related illnesses, including vaccination related illnesses, as well as briefly touch on OSHA's most recent guidance and standards to help keep your workplace safe. With that, I'll turn it over to Rob.
So next slide. So we're gonna jump into the latest breaking news on all this. So just last Thursday, President Biden announced a number of COVID initiatives, primarily focused on vaccinating workers in this country, in both the public sector and the private sector. And so essentially there were three elements to his plan. It's a 6-point plan, I'm going to focus on 3 of them, which I think is enough for any 1-hour presentation. So but the first one is related to federal employees, which, as we all know, is a pretty significant portion of the workforce in this country. This executive order actually updated a prior executive order that mandated COVID vaccines for federal workers or weekly testing. Essentially, this updated executive order eliminated the weekly testing option for federal employees. So they are that's the latest version for federal workers. I doubt we have too many federal employers or agency representatives on the call today, but it's good to know what the rules are, because that may actually set the trend for the private sector. One interesting exception to the federal employee vaccine mandate is for the Postal Service. I think primarily driven by opposition to the vaccine mandate by the Postal Workers Union. And it's certainly an interesting exception, since I can't think of a group of federal employees that interacts with the public more than the postal workers. Nevertheless, that's the exception to the federal employee COVID vaccine mandate. When is this going to be effective? Unclear. The press secretary for the president, Jen Psaki, said that it's probably going to be about 75 days for federal workers to be fully vaccinated. Next slide. And now we're going to talk about federal contractors, which is another huge section of the workforce. By some estimates, federal contractors employ about 1/4 of the U.S. workforce. And so this is another executive order, and indeed it updates a prior executive order which required federal contractors to mandate COVID vaccines for their employees or have them tested. That testing option, just like with federal employees, has been eliminated. And so therefore it's just a straight up COVID vaccine mandate for any federal contractor, well, most federal contractors. So who's impacted by this? Basically, it's any company that provides services to the federal government. So that includes information technology, could include banking, could legal services, construction, manufacturing. So it's a pretty broad swath of the economy that's going to be covered by this federal contractor mandate. So when is this going to be effective? According to the executive order, it's going to apply to new and renewed or extended federal contracts on or after October 15, 2021. So are there any exceptions to this? There are a few. So essentially, if it's a small enough federal contract, so that's less than $250,000, that won't be covered. If it's a federal grant, like a research grant, that wouldn't be subject to this contractor vaccine mandate. Or if you're a subcontractor that provides only products, you're essentially a seller of goods, not services, then that would be something that would not be covered by this federal vaccine contractor vaccine mandate. So what do we know about the contours of this? Well, we don't know a lot yet. There's this White House working group called the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force that is charged with issuing some guidance. We anticipate that next week, September 24, is when this workforce task force is supposed to issue some, or supposed to meet again and maybe issue some compliance about requirements and exceptions. So stay tuned for that. Furthermore, it's this federal contractor vaccine mandate can't take effect until the White House's Office of Management and Budget approves the task force's guidance. So that timetable is a little fuzzy, but we can expect that, given the executive order stating that it's supposed to be effective October 15, 2021, that this task force will move quickly, as will the Office of Management and Budget in the White House. So next slide. now we'll talk about the one that is generating a lot of buzz. This is not an executive order by President Biden, but this is essentially a directive, or him announcing to the public last week that he is going to direct OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is within the Department of Labor, to draft an emergency temporary standard for employers with 100 or more employees that will require that these larger employers, we'll call them, to mandate COVID vaccines or weekly testing for their employees. And I think some commentators would say that this is sort of a soft mandate, namely that employees aren't required to get the vaccine by their employers. They can satisfy the requirement by just providing proof of essentially a negative COVID test every week. So this sort of tracks what the federal government was doing before last week. So I think it's useful to see what the federal government is doing with its employees as maybe a forewarning of what they're going to do with the private sector if things with the pandemic don't go to the liking of the federal government. One other feature that President Biden announced regarding this vaccine mandate for employers with 100 plus employees is that employers are required to give paid time off to any employee to go get the vaccine or to recover from the vaccine's side effects. So that's another, we'll be talking about sort of paid time off and leave issues, but I think this prospective rule is certainly noteworthy in that respect, that it's going to mandate paid time off for the vaccine and side effects. Also, what's noteworthy about this directive to OSHA to do an emergency temporary standard is that because of this is emergency temporary standard rules, there's no public comment that's going to be taken. Virtually every agency in the federal government and for the states that matter that are promulgating rules generally receive public comment about a proposed rule, and then they consider the public input, and then they come out with their final rule. With these emergency standards, there's no public comment. Perhaps a safeguard for that lack of public comment is that they're only supposed to be effective for up to 6 months. And so that's something that is noteworthy. Will this mandate stick for longer than 6 months? Will it be renewed or converted to a regular rule? Another noteworthy issue with respect to this COVID vaccine mandate is that, as with many OSHA penalties for noncompliance, there's a penalty of up to $14,000 per violation, which, depending on the size of your workforce, could result in significant exposure if you have even a few employees who are found to be not in compliance, whether with being not vaccinated or not getting tested weekly. So there's a number of questions which are on the next slide related to these vaccine mandates from the federal government. And first off, with respect to the proposed OSHA rule, how do you count 100 employees? Is it all in one location? Is it company-wide? You include part-time employees, per diem workers? How about independent contractors? How far back do you go? Is it 100 employees in the last 6 months? What if you're a seasonal business and you only have 100 employees for a few weeks or a couple months of the year? How's that going to work? We don't know the answer to that yet. I think as some way to predict how this may turn out, if you're an employer who files an EEO-1 form, which essentially is for employers with 100 or more employees, then you're probably going to be covered by this. And if you don't file an EEO-1 or you're not required to, then there's a pretty good chance you won't be subject to this. Another interesting question is, who's supposed to pay for the COVID tests? Generally speaking, COVID testing is covered by health insurance if it's for diagnostic purposes. Someone's got the sniffles or a cough or a fever, or they've been exposed to someone with COVID-19, and you go to the Walgreens or CVS or wherever to get your test. That's just run through your insurance, and it's not going to be, you're not going to have to pay for it. But if it's a sort of an elective, if you will, elective thing, if you're just going to travel to Canada, or you just want to get a COVID test because you want to go to a concert, or some other event, then you got to pay for it, and it's usually over $100 or $150. I mean, it's not inexpensive. So is this a cost that employers have to bear, or will employees have to pay for it? We think that it's likely, at least in most states, employers will have to pay for this sort of testing. I think one analogy may be like drug testing. Will can employers make employees pay for drug testing? And I think in most states that would be in violation of the state wage and hour laws. How about non-exempt employees getting paid for their time to get tested? Testing takes time. If an employee goes in on a Saturday, or to get their weekly test, which is mandated by the employer, it takes them 2 hours to set it up and then go drive down to the testing center. Is that compensable time? There's some support for the argument that it is compensable time. The U.S. Department of Labor has issued some guidance last year that suggested that if employers mandated employees get tested, that would be compensable time. Whether that guidance would survive this federal, now that this federal mandate is out, I don't know. They may walk that back to encourage more employees to get vaccinated, rather than allow employees who don't want to get vaccinated and go the testing option to essentially get paid extra money to go get the tests every week. And maybe that would be overtime at an overtime rate. So that's an interesting open question, but important as well. And how are employers supposed to verify the worker's vaccination status? There's nothing set in stone yet as to how they're supposed to do that. Are you supposed to collect cards, or copies of the weekly negative test, or will just a weekly affirmation suffice, or maybe some sort of documentation, or just having a policy that says that if an employee comes into work, he or she certifies that they've either had the vaccine or tested negative. What sort of documentation are you going to need? And there's some even more questions that we don't know the answers to just yet. And on the next slide, we how about employees who've been infected? Employees with natural immunity from prior infection, are they going to be treated like vaccinated employees? So far, the federal government has resisted recognizing natural immunity from prior infection as being the equivalent of vaccinated immunity. But the direction of the science on this seems to be that natural immunity has the same, or perhaps even better, effectiveness in terms of preventing infection or serious disease than vaccinated immunity, at least in terms of the information coming out of Israel, which actually Israel is an interesting case study in that they're now taking the position as a country that if your vaccine is more than 6 months old, you're not vaccinated, and essentially you lose your green pass until you get a booster shot. But they actually treat people who have been infected naturally as being the same as vaccinated. So we'll see whether the rules that come out from OSHA treat natural immunity with some equivalence to vaccinated immunity. What about boosters? Again, touching on Israel, also in this country, the news is about boosters is based on the observation that the effectiveness of the first generation of these mRNA vaccines wears off after some period of time. And so therefore, will the OSHA rule require that in order for an employee to be considered vaccinated, that they have a booster that's within the last 6 months? Who knows? But certainly that could be an aspect of this proposed rule. What about medical or religious exemptions? How's that going to be addressed? We know that there's a lot of litigation already about the religious exemptions not being recognized by some of the states in their mandates. So we'll see how that will play out. And that's certainly where you folks will be having to do a lot of heavy lifting. How do we, when you've got an employee who says, I can't get the vaccine because I have a medical condition, or because I have a religious belief, a strongly held, sincerely held religious belief that I can't get the vaccine. how do you accommodate that? We all know that there are, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, you have obligations to engage in an interactive process with employees to try to find a reasonable accommodation. So how is that supposed to work with these mandates that, as far as we know, don't yet recognize those sorts of exceptions? And what about those employers who already have existing incentive and or penalties built into their benefit plans to encourage employees to get the vaccine? Or I should say, even outside of your benefit plans, a lot of employers are giving monetary bonuses or incentives to get vaccines. And we've been reading about some employers like Delta Airlines, and we'll talk about that later, basically saying we're going to put a surcharge on your employee share of the health insurance premium if you don't get the vaccine. Will this mandate essentially convert those kinds of incentive or penalties into ERISA plans? Open questions, but good things to think about as we go forward. Some other things that are worth considering, again, legal challenges. So on the next slide, think about it. What's going to happen when the legal challenges come? I mean, we know they're going to come. I think about 10 states or states governors have already said they're going to sue the federal government on this rule when it's published. And one of the possible bases for this legal challenge is that with respect to OSHA, as I mentioned earlier, when they do a rule, they're supposed to get public input, give a chance for comment, and to the extent they're going to skip the public comment process and the regular months-long, sometimes years-long process of developing a rule, which is a very deliberative process, that if there is an emergency, then there has to be special circumstances. And so those special circumstances would include, essentially, there's got to be some new hazard that poses a grave danger to workers. And so one of the, some of the commentators out there are saying, well, what's the new hazard? We've had COVID for about 18 months now, so this is nothing new. And what's the grave danger? Is to the extent that someone is vaccinated, you keep hearing from the various public health authorities that the vaccines prevent serious injury and death. When I say serious injury, serious disease and death. So you're saying as a federal government that the vaccinated are protected from a grave harm. So how is this rule going to be addressing a grave danger? And so that's going to be one of the angles we anticipate will be used to challenge the rules. Another angle that's going to be pursued, we believe, will be the states are saying this is just overreach by the federal government. The Constitution reserves police powers to address public health and safety to the states, and so that's what the states have as their responsibility, and the federal government can't use this OSHA rule as a way to circumvent that basic state right. So, it's pretty clear these issues are going to be brought very quickly to the courts, and we'll see whether there'll be any temporary injunctive relief to bar OSHA from implementing whatever rule it is that they come up with. And so stay tuned. Next, I'll turn it back over to Liz, who's going to talk about what the states are doing.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, so with the state vaccine mandates, we're seeing a lot of movement there as well. And in some sense, we have a little less of the unknowns that we have for the federal vaccination requirements coming up, but we're still in a lot of gray area and seeing a lot of activity really on the legal front for state mandates. So just a little bit of background. So the power that state and local governments have to issue vaccine mandates is pretty broad, and it's based in US Supreme Court precedent that's over 100 years old at this point. That's Jacobson v. Massachusetts. And that was actually a case about a mandate of the smallpox vaccine with the alternative paying a $5 fine. And the Supreme Court held that states can exercise what's called their police powers to enact mandates for vaccines based on the legislature's determination that vaccination is the best way to go about protecting public health. So that's really what states are relying on, is this really old precedent. Um, a lot of New England states have moved forward with vaccine mandates that we're seeing. And specifically in Maine, I know most of you, if you're from the state, have probably heard about the healthcare worker vaccine mandate. It also extends to emergency medical workers and EMTs, and that deadline is coming up very soon, which is October 1st, before the state starts targeting licensure for facilities with employees who aren't vaccinated, although I think the enforcement's being pushed back a few weeks. Massachusetts, we're seeing a requirement for skilled nursing home staff and recently staff at all rest homes, assisted living residences, facilities, hospice programs. Those workers are going to be required to be vaccinated with exemption options. Connecticut, we have a mandate for state employees, K through 12 employees, early childhood staff, with the option to submit to weekly testing. In New York, and we'll talk a little bit about the challenges that New York's seeing, but they've had or issued mandates for healthcare workers at state-run hospitals, expanded to the rest of healthcare workers. New York City has issued its own set of vaccine mandates as well. So despite the power to issue these vaccine mandates, there are limits, and really what we're seeing are legal challenges based on the lack of exemptions to the vaccination mandates. So currently in Maine, we actually have 2 pending lawsuits against the governor on the basis of the vaccine mandates, and one is a constitutional challenge based on the lack of the religious exemption. Now, Maine has eliminated the religious exemption for vaccines for a couple years, but we haven't seen sort of the same objection that we're seeing to the COVID vaccine. And I think it's important to understand that sort of the differentiation here is that the religious exemption is being used on the basis that the vaccines are being developed with cells from aborted or terminated fetal material. And so that's commonly cited as the basis for the need for a religious exemption to the vaccination versus other vaccinations that have been required in the past. So the other lawsuit in Maine is regarding the mandate being unconstitutional, arguing that DHHS should have obtained legislative approval, gone through a public hearing process before issuing the mandate. And New York is seeing some of these similar types of legal challenges as well. And actually in the last few days, we've seen the results of those challenges. So similar to Maine, those lawsuits have claimed that a religious exemption should be available. And a federal judge in New York actually granted the temporary restraining order related to the vaccine mandate for healthcare workers based on the lack of a religious exemption. So that was pretty significant
2 days ago,
development.
Right?
Oh, go ahead, Rob.
That was 2 days ago.
Oh, 2 days ago. Yeah, very, very recently. And a state judge, I believe, actually issued or granted the TRO for against the New York City's vaccine mandate as well. So these are really actively developing legal challenges, and Maine's are still pending right now, but as we see more and more the lack of exemption availability for religion, religious exemption, I think we'll keep seeing these developments. And it's important, if you are a facility that would be covered by these vaccine mandates, to pay attention to what's going on in the news and what's going on in the courts as far as enforcing or prohibiting enforcement of these vaccine mandates.
Yeah. I think it's worth noting that to the extent you're on the fence about whether you want to do a vaccine mandate for your employees, it may be prudent to stay on the sidelines for a little while to see how this all plays out, rather than anticipate what either OSHA or some other federal agency or state agency is going to do with respect to vaccine mandates. Because I think once you implement one of these policies, again, it's fairly controversial to some people. If you have to walk it back because of a court order, that can be somewhat awkward. And so again, I think that the litigation is fast and furious at this point, And so we're certainly going to see more, not less of this. And as Liz touched on, the religious exemption in particular is getting a lot of attention right now. But just getting back to the fact that at least in many states, including Maine, there was an elimination 2 years ago of the religious exemption from the prior vaccine mandates, primarily in healthcare, and also it's related to schools. To the extent that this religious based challenge succeeds in New York or Maine or elsewhere, that could certainly pull the rug out from underneath those prior laws and mandates, because I think that the legal arguments are essentially the same. And religious exemptions are not just based on the fact that there may be some cell line derived from an aborted fetus from 20 years ago. The religious exemption is actually quite broad, and you can have a religion of one person. It just has to be a sincerely held religious belief. And to the extent that there are other vaccines that use or at least in some part of the development or manufacture, cell lines derived from aborted fetuses, some of those are already on the current school and also healthcare vaccine list, like the MMR vaccine. I think maybe the rubella vaccine would be subject to the same sort of objection that we're seeing now with respect to the COVID vaccines. So it's a pretty interesting environment. The tentacles of these legal challenges are reach pretty far.
No, it definitely is. And another interesting spot that we are seeing developments is in laws that are being enacted based on anti-discrimination and access for people regardless of their vaccination status. So many states have actually been passing laws prohibiting vaccine passports for local governments from requiring proof of vaccination to get certain services or enter certain areas. Some states have gone even further. Florida, for example, has a law that bars businesses from requiring customers to show vaccine documentation. Indiana currently has pending legislation prohibiting employers from requiring vaccines as a condition of employment if it's against a religious belief. So again, that religious exemption. So it'll be interesting to see how these types of laws are playing out in conjunction with the federal mandate and the state mandates that are going on, as well as private employers' abilities to control their workforce and their patrons and comply with CDC requirements and OSHA requirements. So to the extent that legislation is being passed in your state, it's important to just be aware that those types of laws are coming. They are pending in a lot of states, and just be aware that those might impact you. Next slide. All right, so we touched a little bit, and we'll dive a little bit more into voluntary vaccine mandates. So we've been talking about the federal and state mandates. But as far as those organizations who don't fall into those categories where you might be subject to a federal or a state mandate, we've heard a lot about employers issuing their own mandates for employees, and the legal issues aren't quite the same as they are for the state and the federal mandates. But can you mandate your vaccine or mandate the vaccine for your employees? The answer is generally yes, if you want to. And there's a should you discussion as well to this that we'll dive into on the next slide, I believe. But according to EEOC guidance, employers are clear to require that employees physically entering the workplace get their COVID vaccine. You must provide, though, religious and disability-based exemptions under Title VII and the ADA. We'll talk a little bit more about accommodations later on. And the discussion gets a little trickier when you do have employees who are disabled, who are coming into your workplace and you have a vaccine mandate. If you have individuals who have a disability and can't get vaccinated, that really draws a new analysis of determining whether, first of all, the vaccine requirement is job-related and consistent with business necessity at your organization, and then looking at whether the individual would pose a direct threat to the health and safety of other people in the workplace. if unvaccinated, which is the safety requirement that we're trying to get compliance with. That requires a number, looking at a number of factors such as the risk, the nature of the harm that they might impose. It's a really specific analysis for each employee and for the type of workplace that we have. It also involves looking at the science, and the science is changing daily, weekly, monthly. We're getting new data about how effective vaccines are, both at preventing disease as well as transmission, how it impacts transmission among people. So it's not quite a clear-cut answer as far as how an unvaccinated employee poses a direct threat to other people in the workforce. But the EEOC does instruct us to look at the latest on science, how your workforce is operating, who the employee is interacting with, and then whether there's an accommodation for not getting a vaccine if an employee has a disability and is unable to do so. Next slide, unless Rob, yeah, I think this one too.
Yeah, as Liz said, this is this gets pretty sticky when you are faced with a situation where an employee says, I have an allergy to one of the ingredients of these vaccines, and my doctor said I can't get the shot or get the second shot because first time I had a really bad reaction. Or somebody says to you, I have a history. Actually, I already had COVID last year, and my doctor said to me that I really shouldn't get I don't need the shot, and it's all risk to me. There's no benefit, and here's this Israeli study that says that natural immunity is better than vaccinated immunity, or the Cleveland Clinic study, or and they say my accommodation that I want is to be treated just like all the vaccinated people. And so then you're like, well, I'm not a doctor, but the CDC says that I can, or the CDC recommends that vaccinated or people who had say prior infection get the vaccine anyway. And the CDC says that, geez, just because you've had an allergic reaction doesn't mean that you can't get the shot. If you don't have a specific allergy to something, in the shot, in the ingredient, or a specific allergy to one of the ingredients in the shot, then you should still get it. So you're being put in a pretty awkward position of being essentially trying to make a scientific medical evaluation as to whether some risk posed by an unvaccinated person is so significant that it justifies excluding them from the workforce, terminating them, or taking some other kind of action. And so, as Liz said, the science on this is just evolving, as we speak. So, but in terms of where at least what are the guideposts here, when you're trying to do a mandate for COVID vaccines, there is this little different category for employers who actually are administering the shots, or hiring someone to do the shots on site. Then, as Liz said, you've got to show that you're either you or your contractor, because they're making, they have to ask a series of questions of the employee's health before they administer the shot. To do that, this inquiry has to be job related and consistent with business necessity, because what you're doing is essentially inquiring about whether somebody's got a disability, and that puts you into this whole ADA framework. And in order to carry this out, to carry out this program, if you're going to treat people differently because of their unvaccinated status, you've got to do that based on objective evidence, which I think some observers would say is more than just say, well, I'm just relying on the CDC guidance. Objective evidence means like study and data, and this signals that there'll be a battle of experts if this ever gets litigated. And the key issue here is whether having an unvaccinated person work in the workplace is going to pose a direct threat to the health or safety of that employee or others. And again, with this evolution in the science about the duration of the vaccines, are they wearing off over time, as suggested by some of the most recent data, including this, essentially the need for booster shots that clearly implies that they wear off. You know, how do you treat someone who's unvaccinated differently than someone who's been vaccinated but more than, say, 6 or 7 months ago? Can you justify treating them differently? Maybe you can, but again, this just demonstrates what a tricky environment this is for employers who are faced with employees who have legal rights, a right to request an accommodation for their religious or medical disabilities. And if you don't honor that request, then you are put in at least jeopardy of being sued for not recognizing and providing that employee their rights. And of course, healthcare employers are in this state and in New York and Massachusetts, who are facing a mandate from the state governments to basically say you've got to make sure your employees are vaccinated, and there's no religious exemption, or they're basically saying in Maine, for instance, the order from the governor essentially says that if somebody isn't vaccinated, they can't even work in the building, in the facility. So that certainly limits the number of accommodations you might otherwise consider, like let's take them out of a frontline job and put them over somewhere else in the building doing billing or something that's maybe, chart review or something that's less public facing or patient facing. So some of these state mandates are actually tying the employer's hands with respect to what sorts of accommodations can be offered. So employers are put in a pretty awkward and awful spot where if they don't give the employee the accommodation that's reasonable under normal circumstances, then they get sued by the employee. But if they do give the employee that accommodation, let's say they put him in an office doing billing or some sort of non-patient facing work, they can lose their license to operate the healthcare facility because they're not complying with the state mandate. So this is a situation where employers are going to be finding themselves and making the decision as which is the better bad option. And right now we don't really know how to assess all that, given the fluid nature of this environment, including all the litigation. So I guess the next slide has to do with reasonable accommodations. And I think, Liz, was this your slide or is this mine?
Yeah, this is mine. So, with all of that we were just talking about, I thought it'd be helpful to talk a little bit more about reasonable accommodations, what employer obligations are, what potential accommodations might be. And so we've talked a little bit, of course, in the last couple of minutes about requiring vaccines for employees. But one other area I wanted to flag is related to employees who are pregnant. The EEOC has issued guidance in the last couple months about employees who are not vaccinated because they are pregnant. And the distinction here, I think, is important. It's not because they are not able to be vaccinated because of pregnancy, but also because people choose not to be vaccinated because of pregnancy. And the EEOC has suggested that employees who fall into that category may be entitled to reasonable accommodations that are being offered to others with similar abilities or inabilities to work based on sort of that status. So that's just something to consider, fall into that category. So when we're talking about reasonable accommodations, if you are planning on mandating a vaccine, I think it's important to really have two lines of discussion with your workforce. First, communicating with your employees about the process for requesting a reasonable accommodation. And I know many of you with employee handbooks and employee policies, have procedures in place about requesting a reasonable accommodation. Those are great places to start for requesting accommodations for a vaccine. You may also provide separate guidance on specifically accommodations for the vaccine if it is going to be a little bit different than your usual accommodation policy. Second, and just as important, is communicating with your managers and your supervisors about what to do in light of an accommodation request. Every supervisor or manager should have an idea of what to do if they get wind that somebody needs an accommodation, even if it's just who do I tell? Who do I report this to? And that way, we're making sure that requests for accommodation don't get lost, and also that people are treated consistently and responded to consistently to avoid liability and exposure for discrimination claims later on. So once you get to that point, though, of you have a request, now what do? We have to figure out what is a reasonable accommodation. This is the point, where it's time to decide sort of what works for your workplace, what is feasible as far as an accommodation to getting the vaccine. And, the EEOC has provided a few examples of what they, would suggest for reasonable accommodations or what could possibly be considered reasonable. Wearing face masks, social distancing, getting periodic testing, given the opportunity to telework. Somebody who works in a manufacturing organization might not have the opportunity to telework, so it's important to look at other options that are available. So really looking at your workplace and considering what's possible, of course, without providing undue hardship, which is a historically difficult standard to reach, but it is something that's available if accommodating an exception request is going to be difficult. And next slide.
Just as an aside, I think that if the accommodation requested by an employee would require the employer to violate a rule or law, that's generally viewed to be unreasonable and therefore something you don't have to accommodate. And this touches on what I raised a minute ago, which is under normal circumstances, somebody said, hey, I want to, I can't get the shot because I'm pregnant or don't want to, or because of an allergy, and the employer might say, okay, well, how about we just transfer you to this other position where maybe you have less interaction with, coworkers and the like. But if you've got these other overriding federal and state mandates that sort of eliminate those accommodations that might otherwise be reasonable, the employers are in a pretty awkward spot, which is one reason why the litigation that's unfolding is important to sort of keep a close eye on, see how that unfolds. Because if you would deny an accommodation to somebody today based on your current belief of what the law is, and then the law gets flipped or changed or invalidated by a legal challenge a month from now, you basically just set yourself up for being sued. So this is why I think employers are in a pretty awkward spot now with all these vaccine mandates coming from the state and federal governments.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Rob. And so I see a question also, about religious accommodation and, essentially what if you have a vaccine mandate and you have somebody wanting a religious accommodation not to get the vaccine. So you ask for weekly testing and they might have a religious objection to weekly testing. In that case, the accommodation obviously is not feasible. And so you do still have that duty to look for other accommodations that might be possible in your workplace. And depending on your work environment and what the employee does for work, there may or may not be reasonable accommodations available. So it's important to just have that dialogue and those discussions about what will work, because you do have a duty to do that as an employer. So just briefly, verifying the need for accommodation. This is going to be really similar to other accommodation requests unrelated to vaccination. If an employee has a disability that's not known or obvious, you are permitted to ask questions, ask for medical documentation regarding the disability, as well as the need for accommodation. Religious accommodations can be a little trickier on the documentation front. We talked a little bit earlier about how this isn't just limited to organized religions or what the Pope says. That doesn't necessarily dictate whether somebody has a sincerely held religious belief. It really is a personal belief that can be the basis for this accommodation. But with that, employers are still permitted to ask for statements or explanations from the employee that talk about the nature of the beliefs that they're asserting prevent them from complying with the mandate. How they practice their belief, sort of what supports their religious belief from religious texts, even potentially statements from third parties. about the individual's religious beliefs. But with all of this, it's really important to remember to be applying consistent standards when you're asking your workforce to respond to these requests, so that you're applying similar documentation requirements regardless of religion, regardless of belief, and regardless of disability. Next slide.
Yeah, so here's some additional issues, as if there aren't aren't enough already. So if you are an employer who has a unionized workforce, how do these vaccine mandates, whether they're imposed by the state or federal government or just by the employer deciding to implement these mandates, come into play? And I'll start with the employers now, which is becoming a smaller and smaller group apparently, that are not subject to state or federal mandates. But for those employers who still have the discretion as to whether they want to apply a vaccine mandate, I think for those employers, vaccine mandates would very likely be a mandatory subject of bargaining, and so you could not unilaterally do it without first getting the consent or bargaining with the union. With respect to those, this now fairly large group of employers that is or will be subject to state or federal COVID vaccine mandates, I think that this is now becoming less of an issue that would have to be a mandatory subject of bargaining. Although I wouldn't say it's completely eliminated. I think you still have an obligation to bargain around the edges of the mandate. So to the extent there's some discretion for employers about, whether termination is appropriate versus, say, a leave of absence for some period of time, or how to handle testing or who pays for testing, things like that. Those sorts of issues would still be subject to bargaining. But to be sure, the fact that there's a state or federal mandate certainly takes much of that issue off the bargaining table for dealing with the union. Other negative impacts on morale, or risk of collective activity or union activity under the National Labor Relations Act because of all these mandates. Certainly in the private sector, again, for those employees or employers who are not yet or will be covered by any of these state or federal mandates. If you impose this sort of mandate on employees, anytime you do that, there's going to be some group of employees. How big depends on the workforce or where you're located. Certainly, it would play a role. And unions love to capitalize on that argument that, geez, employers wouldn't be able to do this to you if you had a union. We'll be your voice. We can fight for you. And so that's a pretty effective organizing strategy. And maybe it only resonates with 20 or 30% of your workforce, but you only need 30% of your workforce to sign union recognition cards to get an election. So this is an important issue. And even if outside of the union context, negative morale, I think we've been reading a lot about employees quitting or willing to get fired over getting the vaccine. And certainly in healthcare, which is already subject to a worker shortage, there are going to be some pretty significant impacts to some employers if they lose even 10 or 20% of their workforce over this issue. We know that three nursing homes in Maine have already said they're going to close because of at least due in part to the governor's order requiring vaccines for all healthcare workers. The news earlier this week, I guess it was a hospital in upstate New York, said they're not going to be able to deliver any babies because they've already lost staff over the vaccine issue, so they're just going to stop doing that work. So we're seeing these sorts of stories all over the country now, and so the ripple effect, again, even if just a relatively small percentage, 5, 10, 20% of the workforce decides I'm going to get fired over this issue, or I'm going to quit, that can significantly affect just about any business. There's OSHA retaliation issues, which over this vaccine mandate issues, like, I think the vaccine's unsafe, or I had a bad injury. There's OSHA did a flip-flop a few months ago where they initially said that employees who had a bad reaction to the vaccine, if they missed any time from work, then that would be a OSHA recordable injury. And then because there was a perception that would discourage some employers from making their employees get vaccinated, because otherwise they'd have to record the injury as on their log, which most employers are loath to do if they can avoid it. And OSHA said, well, we won't enforce this rule until next year, till 2022. But when you get into the OSHA context and you have employees complaining about injuries not getting reported, they're now sort of radioactive as kind of an OSHA whistleblower, and that's a statute that's been weaponized from time to time. And then we've got the issue of what about vaccine injuries? Somebody who's which implicitly has been recognized by the president in this most recent directive to OSHA, that if somebody misses time because of a vaccine side effect, you got to pay them for it. Well, how long? How long do you have to pay them? And even if it's just a small percentage of the workforce, as we all know, a few workers' comp claims can add up to a lot of money. And so, how soon do you have to file a first report of injury if somebody is out? Arguably, the normal rules would apply. I think the consensus among most practitioners is that if you have a mandated vaccine for the employer, whether it's COVID or any other kind of vaccine, flu even, and there's a bad reaction, then that's arguably a work-related injury, and then that goes into the workers' comp system of whatever state you're in. And so that that's an injury that's certainly, or an issue that certainly is out there. And I suspect that the workers' comp insurance carriers in this country are not excited about the prospect of now having to pick up the tab for any claimed work-related vaccine injuries. Even if it's a very small number, it can still add up. Again, these are carriers that have not charged a premium to insure this risk, at least not yet. So that's another potential issue to keep our eyes on. And then there's tort liability too. Let's say that somebody, hopefully not, but let's say there's a bad outcome, whether it's an alleged a death or some permanent disability. You can anticipate that that plaintiff's lawyers will look for ways to get around the Workers' Comp Act and sue for tort damages, especially if a company is alleged to have been, or maybe even a decision maker at the company, the CEO or somebody like that, overlooks known risks associated with the vaccine. Let's say makes people who have prior immunity get the shot. And that person alleges that there was only risk for me, and that employer sort of went outside the Workers' Comp Act immunity protections and should be sued individually. So again, this is mostly speculation, but certainly we can anticipate that to the extent there's injuries alleged to flow from the vaccine, people will be looking for compensation. And it's worth noting that under the PrEP Act, the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act of 2015, that statute, when triggered, and it was triggered at the very beginning of the pandemic, essentially provides total immunity to the manufacturers of any medical intervention, including vaccines that are used during a public emergency or pandemic. And so the vaccine manufacturers are totally immune from any damages caused by the vaccine, even if there's negligence on their part. So let's say they make a bad batch, and that leads to some injuries. And indeed, the news out of Japan within the last week or two is that the Moderna vaccine was contaminated with, I think, stainless steel is what Moderna identified as the problem. But there were 3 people who died in Japan who got vaccinated from that bad Moderna batch. Whether the deaths were connected, these were like 30-year-old people. Whether the deaths were connected to the vaccine, who knows? But certainly there were 3 deaths associated with that contaminated batch. But under that circumstance, in this country, Moderna is totally immune from liability, even if there was negligence. Same with the provider. If the provider makes a mistake, injects the vaccine into the shoulder, bursa, resulting in a paralyzed arm or disabled arm, no liability under the PrEP Act. But that doesn't extend to employers. So to the extent that you're the only person left exposed with deep pockets, then I think again you can anticipate that there'll be an extra effort at trying to figure out a way to attach tort liability to employers for any vaccine injury. Next slide.
Right, I realize we're at the 10:30 mark, but I'm just going to, so I definitely understand if folks have to take off here. But I'm just going to touch on sort of some key points on employer vaccination programs. So incentives. So whether, if you're not mandating a vaccine, but rather doing an incentive program, um, just clarifying sort of what you're capable or what you're able to do for incentives. The key thing here is the distinction between whether the employer is providing the vaccine either through itself or through its agent or contractor, or if you're requiring just sort of proof from a third party that the employee received a vaccine outside of your organization, unrelated to any program from the organization. So if the employer is offering the vaccine as part of an incentive program, the key thing to remember is that the incentive for getting the vaccine can't be so substantial that it becomes coercive. This is a gray area, but something to consider as far as whether you're offering a day of PTO versus 2 weeks of PTO or a month of PTO or financial incentives, things like that can't rise to the level of coercive. If the vaccine is not being offered by you or your agent, but rather you're requesting just proof of vaccination from a third party, then the EEOC is suggesting that this is not a requirement, that it not be so substantial so as not to be coercive, but certainly keeping it reasonable, I think, is reducing risk there. Penalties is something that we've seen come up in the news more lately. And especially some of you might have heard of what Delta Airlines has done with their $200 monthly penalty or surcharge for their health insurance program. It seems that this has been effective for them. They've actually, I believe, had 4,000 employees or 4% of their workforce get vaccinated since they announced the mandate. But these penalties don't operate quite as simply, not that incentives are simple, but they're not quite governed by the same rules as the incentive programs in all cases, especially if you're dealing with a surcharge on health insurance. So it's a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation as far as the employee benefits aspects of applying penalties like HIPAA, cafeteria plan rules, ACA rules, but be aware if you are considering a plan like that those rules may apply, and it's really important to make sure that you're compliant. One other aspect to consider with penalties is wage and hour implications, more of a traditional employment concern, but what I'm referring to specifically here is paycheck deductions. Many state laws have pretty serious restrictions on what you can deduct from an employee's paycheck. So penalties that aren't related to insurance or a healthcare program might still be impermissible if they're just a straight deduction because they're in violation of state law.
All right. So I think we'll run through these questions and then maybe the last few slides very quickly. But I think that, again, these are pretty important issues. So if you have a few extra minutes, be great if you could stick around. But if not, we're certainly available for questions after if you want to send us an email. But so some open-ended questions. Again, this is sort of relates to short-term leave issues. So should employees or must employees be paid for time missed from work to get the vaccine? Well, we know that with respect to this new proposed OSHA rule by President Biden, that the answer will be yes for employers with 100 or more employees. Outside of that, the answer is, that's actually many states have actually kind of gotten into this. California is one, I believe. That where you have to pay employees to go get the vaccine, and I think you can actually apply for some from federal or state money to get reimbursed for some of that. But this is one where the answer is generally it depends. Will be yes for many employers, but ordinarily you wouldn't have to pay employees for time to go get the vaccine. But if there's a mandate, then arguably whether it's a state or federal or employer discretionary mandate, you'd probably have to pay for it if it's during work time. How about paid for time missed from work to get due to vaccine side effects? Again, with the new OSHA rule that we anticipate coming out in the next month or so. from the federal administration, the answer is yes for that. Outside of that, it depends. I mean, the original Families First Coronavirus Response Act from it seems like ages ago, March of 2020, had some money in there for employers to pay employees who miss time from work, not so much for the vaccine, but actually ended up probably getting ahead of myself for COVID. But these are at least with respect to vaccine related time off from work. This is what, generally speaking, you do have to or will have to if the OSHA rule applies to, and otherwise, if you have sick time policies, that would certainly be something that could apply to this as well if you don't otherwise have a federal or state mandate for this. How about time missed from work to get tested for COVID? This is going to be one where, generally speaking, unless you're in healthcare, the answer is generally no. But if you are a healthcare employer and you're subject to the OSHA emergency temporary standard that was published in June, then the answer is very likely to be yes if there's essentially a strong suspicion of like if you've been exposed to somebody is COVID positive, then generally speaking, you'd have to pay for that time to go get tested. And as with respect to the fourth question, you have to pay employees for time missed from work to either quarantine or recover from COVID-19. And again, we're beyond just about to be beyond any application of this Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which gave some paid time off for employees who were quarantining or recovering from COVID-19. But again, if you're in the healthcare setting and you're subject to this OSHA emergency temporary standard that was published in June, then the answer is very likely to be yes. So this is one where I think it's worth keeping an eye on developments. And if you do have somebody who's missing time from work to get tested from COVID or for COVID, or missing time from work for quarantine, or recovering from COVID-19, and let's say they're not otherwise getting paid through your regular paid time off policy, you may want to just give us a call and get some advice on this.
All right. So sort of coming off of that conversation, thinking about longer term leave for COVID related reasons, key date coming up is going to be September 30th, and that's when the tax credits for emergency FMLA and paid sick leave will stop being offered. To the extent that you have voluntarily offered that since the extension in April and have employees who haven't used their allotment of leave yet, you should consider being prepared for any requests that come up before the expiration of the tax credits comes up. It's also important to remember just even though that type of leave might not be available for the traditional COVID-related reasons, you still should keep in mind what your state and federal laws would require, as well as your own PTO policies and leave policies, sick leave policies. In Maine, we have the earned paid time off law, so that would, for employers with more than 10 employees, that permits leave for any reason. So that might be a quarantine situation. It might be an illness situation. Just keeping in mind what your obligations will be. Similarly for FMLA, ADA related leave, workers' compensation, which I think Rob is going to touch on briefly on the next slide, but I wanted to flag one issue that I think is interesting, and that's called long COVID, which is sort of a newer term, I believe, sort of referring to the longer term effects of the COVID illness. It is possibly a disability, according to Department of Human Services, the United States. That definitely could be something that you may see in your employees if you've had employees who are ill. Might constitute a disability requiring leave as an accommodation under the ADA going forward. So it's important to be aware of that. Next slide.
Yeah, and I touched on several of these issues already with respect to workers' compensation and in terms of whether are benefits available for vaccine side effects. The answer is very likely yes, if it's been mandated by the employer, and this includes, I think, in the employer subject to these federal mandates. How big of an exposure is this to employers? I don't think we know yet. There's a federal database that's been around for about 30 years that collects information on vaccine side effects. Generally speaking, it's been there just for the sort of mumps, measles, rubella, flu vaccine, things like that. But it's been used to track COVID vaccine injuries, and it's just being, again, the system is generally criticized by many as being incomplete, has lots of weaknesses. But about 10 years ago, the Department of Health and Human Services commissioned a study that was done by Harvard Medical School, and that study suggested that the system actually misses like 95 or 99% of vaccine injuries. That was pre-COVID, so who knows if it's gotten better at collecting injuries. But as of just a couple of weeks ago, September 3, the system had recorded over 14,000 deaths related to the COVID vaccines, and about 18,000 permanent disabilities, and about 58,000 hospitalizations. And this is out of over like 300 million doses. So that seems like a small number, but if you're a workers' comp carrier and you're dealing with 18,000 permanent disability claims, or a handful, let's say it's only 5,000 permanent disability claims and only 5,000 death claims, that's a lot of money for an insurance carrier and a workers' comp claim. So I think you can see, or at least predict, that there'll be a pretty vigorous defense mounted by the workers' comp carriers to these kinds of injuries, just given how difficult they could be to prove. And that sort of relates to my last point about workers' comp insurance carriers. So, and then going on to the next slide about OSHA guidance in general. I think this, Liz, you've got this one.
Yeah. So I know since we are so far past, I won't spend too much time here, but basically these are just sort of some points to keep in mind from OSHA's guidance about how to keep your workplace safe. A lot of you are probably implementing these things already, but if employees want to get vaccinated, facilitate that. Potentially provide time during the day to go get vaccinated. Instruct people who are sick not to come to work. People who've had close contact not to come to work. Really keeping in touch with what the CDC guidance is. And while CDC guidance may not be perfect, and it's flexible, and we're sort of yet to see how that holds up in a court on various issues, it still is instructive, and it's helpful to pay attention to and follow. Implement physical distancing in communal areas. OSHA sort of focuses on different standards for unvaccinated versus vaccinated, which is based on I think CDC guidance currently. But I think it is important to keep in mind that things are in flux, things are changing. There are breakthrough cases. So, just because someone is vaccinated or unvaccinated, keeping protocols in place is important. Educating workers on your COVID-19 policies, procedures, providing PPE, those sorts of things. And then the last slide, I think.
Yeah, and this is sort of more of the same and more of what most employers are already doing, just that is suggesting that customers, visitors, guests wear face coverings. And again, prior OSHA guidance was talking about sort of distinguishing between unvaccinated and vaccinated. And as recently as July, OSHA guidance was basically saying that we need to protect the unvaccinated from the vaccinated in light of all these breakthrough cases that these were coming out of places like Massachusetts. And now that seems to be an inversion in the messaging, that we need to protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated. So it's hard to keep up. But some of these things are still sort of tried and true recommendations from OSHA. These are guidelines, not necessarily mandates, but ventilation systems should be updated and maintained, routine cleaning, disinfection, record your COVID infections and deaths, implement, protections from retaliation for employees who complain about safety issues, and just follow these ever-changing OSHA standards. So this is where I guess just stay abreast of what's going on and just know that we're in a pretty fluid environment. thank you so much for spending your time with us this morning. And if you do have any questions, feel free to send Liz or me an email. We tried to answer some of the questions as they popped up on the chat box as we went. And I think we hit a number of the questions as in our specific comments. But if we didn't, just let us know. So thanks again. The slides should be available later this morning if you want to download them. And also, if you want your SHRM credit for this, that should be available later this morning as well. Thank you. Oh, this question about where should COVID infections be reported that just popped up. My understanding is you're still supposed to, you can report those to the CDC in your state is probably the best place to report these sorts of infections to. Although I'm not sure there's a mandate necessarily, for at least from OSHA, or generally speaking, for non-healthcare employers to report COVID. But if you are in healthcare, there certainly are reporting requirements for cases. But if you have a specific industry you want to ask about on reporting obligations, just feel free to send us a line. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.